I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Before we begin this edition of the program, I'd like to remind you that you can support my work on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. It is you, the listener, that helps to make this show possible. I only have one other sponsor. Otherwise, it is you that sponsors this show and makes it possible. So, with that being said, head on over to patreon.com/parallaxviews. Again, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews, and if you can, send me a few bucks. Also, check out my sponsor, Mike Swanson of wallstreetwindow.com. wallstreetwindow.com offers a great straight-shooting financial and trading newsletter. I've had listeners tell me that they've made return on investment from Mike's trading tips. So head on over to wallstreetwindow.com, where you can subscribe to the newsletter and receive Mike's free ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. With that out of the way, on this edition of the program, we welcome back to the program Israeli dissident Ori Goldberg. He's probably one of the most prominent and well-known dissidents in Israel at this moment, given that he has appeared on such programs as the Owen Jones Show and many other programs. He's very sought after, and I'm very glad to say that he's something of a regular guest on this program. We'll be discussing the latest in regards to Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank on this edition of the program. Of course, there's a lot to unpack right now, especially with the peace talks happening. Will this be the end of the bombing we've been witnessing in Gaza? Will the hostages be released? Will Palestinian prisoners be released? We'll have to see, but I hope you'll find this conversation offers some food for thought as the situation in the Middle East continues to be a subject that this program closely follows. With that being said, let's get right to it with Ori Goldberg. Welcome back to Parallax Views. Ori Goldberg, a former university professor who has written extensively on Iran and now has chosen to bear witness to what is happening in Israel and what we're witnessing in Gaza. Was that a good description, you think, or?
Yeah, the most apt one I can think of.
So, Ori, you've become one of my most popular guests. A lot of people find your insights very valuable. And given what's happening now with Trump saying there's going to be a peace deal, that Netanyahu has accepted it, a lot of people seem to think this war is finally winding down. What do you make of it?
I'm cautiously optimistic that we will see an end to the active bombing and slaughter. I think there's a long period ahead of squabbling over who gets to decide what. But one of the reasons I'm cautiously optimistic is because I think we're seeing the very rare good side of Trump's erratic behavior and understanding of the world, because I think Trump has finally had enough of Netanyahu. And you and I have spoken about this, about how Trump doesn't like Netanyahu and doesn't trust Netanyahu and is not ideologically beholden to Israel the way President Biden was. And I think that for two reasons this is happening now. One is that Netanyahu has made a real concentrated effort to burn all of his bridges and to make Israel a liability even for Trump. And the second is that for the first time since this genocide began, the Arab countries, especially the Gulf monarchies, are standing together as a counterweight to Israeli influence in DC. And Trump appreciates them more and identifies his future with them much more than he does with a degrading, imploding Israel. So, for those two reasons, not at all because anybody cares about the genocide or the plight of the Palestinians, I think we may see an end to active hostilities. We'll still see a lot of bloodshed. Israel will demand all kinds of rights and privileges, but I think Israel has missed out on the turning of the tide, and I think Israel will get a lot less than what it assumes it will get.
What's the tone or the attitude you're seeing amongst your fellow Israelis right now?
Um, I guess I'd call it a rude awakening. Certainly, there's no reckoning. In fact, the general, murderousness quotient of the tone and the discourse are only rising because despair is setting in. There's this understanding that all of this has been done and there's absolutely nothing to show for it. I'll be very, very cynical and blunt and say that had the genocide succeeded or had ethnic cleansing succeeded, and we would have reached a reality in which Palestinians are no longer a major player when it comes to Gaza or even the West Bank, a lot of Israelis would say, well, it wasn't pleasant, but at least it got the job done. Fact is, no job has been finished. No mission has been accomplished. The hostages, even if there's a deal that gets them back, there are probably less than 20 still living. We started out with 250. When it comes to the destruction of Hamas, even assuming that Hamas agrees to everything it has already agreed to, and that Hamas steps down as the active ruler of Gaza, Hamas isn't going to go away. And Israel based much of its moral imperative of carrying out the genocide on the destruction of Hamas. So a lot of Israelis are freaked out by this because what was it good for, to in the immortal words of the bard. And I think that's why you see a lot of anger and you see a lot of hostility and the general tone that says, pardon my French, but fuck the Palestinians. It's their problem and they're getting everything that's coming to them, and we should keep bombing the stuffing out of them, is still very much present, even more so. But I think it is founded on a real sense of despair.
Is there, I hate to word it this way, but is there a sense of self-pity in Israel?
There always is. We wouldn't be Israelis if we didn't pity
If
ourselves.
only people could see the expression on your face when you initially responded to that.
Yeah, man, I'll narrate it for them. The expression was "duh," basically. Of course, there's self-pity. Part of our sense of self is being perennial victims, and having everything happen to us and not being understood and not being appreciated. Now it's all about, because it's the easiest, now it's all turning to, it's always been age-old anti-Semitism. It's not about what Israel does. It's never about any kind of actual practical context, but it's always the same and it'll always be the same. So we have to just bear it. But the self-pity is always there because we're always victims. When we get our act together, we tell ourselves, we can also become the ultimate aggressors. That's what we were trying to do over the past 2 years, not just with regard to Palestinians, but with regard to the rest of the Middle East. But our basic stance is one of not just victims, but victims who are owed, and we will always come to collect what we're owed. But in order to successfully collect, we have to maintain our perennial victim status.
I also wanted to ask you, is there a sense, or maybe even like a false hope? I think you've talked about this even on your social media, that Israelis are thinking, well, maybe things will go back to normal after this. There's just high anti-Semitism now, and there's anti-Israel sentiment now. But once there's a ceasefire, things will just go back to normal. And I think you've argued that that is delusional.
There certainly is a sense that things will go back to normal. Again, it helps when you assume that every anti-Israel vibe right now is based on something that is not contextual, that is not case specific. It's based on a general human anti-Semitic tendency. Okay, everybody's always been against us, and they always will be. It helps because if that's true, then it's a cycle, and we're used to cycles. As much as the Holocaust may have been a singularity, Jews are used to massacres, they're used to the majority population flipping on them, they're used to the world hating them. And this is a cycle as well. And all these people, starting with the Saudis and Emiratis who don't really care about the Palestinians and only want to make deals. So ultimately, they will make a deal because we have stuff to sell them. But all the other governments that stood by us, uh, some Israelis on the hard Israeli right are thinking and describing Israel as a bastion of Judeo-Christian civilization fighting the good fight against the Muslim hordes that are destabilizing the West from within. There you get alliances between the Israeli government and people like the UK's Tommy Robinson, but even people who are not ideologically extreme in that sense, that's their basic hope. Yes, we did what we had to do, and bad things happen to good people in wars. And this will stop, and we will rebuild, we will regroup, both domestically and globally. Again, the desperation is oh so clear. I don't think your American listeners understand the great meaning attached in Israel to this silly event called the Eurovision Song Contest, which is again a cultural song, a song competition where all the countries of Europe send representatives, and one of them wins, and the winning country gets the right to host the Eurovision next year. Winning the Eurovision Song Contest, as Israel has, I think it was 4 times, is considered a very, very big deal. And we are very much engaged with the question of whether the European Broadcasting Union, which is the European body that organizes the song contest, will throw us out. And just yesterday, the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, said that if Israel is thrown out, then Germany will consider withdrawing, which is a big deal. And those are the headlines on a day when Israel was supposed to stop bombing Gaza and more than 60 Palestinians were killed because Israel took what the IDF is calling defensive action. So that kind of dissonance, that kind of dissociative behavior and interpretation of reality, delusional is a polite word for it.
Do you also want to talk about? I know you have a lot of people will focus on criticisms of the hard right in Israel, but I think you also have criticisms, very strident criticisms of liberal Zionists in Israel as well. And one thing I think that a lot of people don't understand is there may be protests against how Israel is handling Gaza, but that doesn't necessarily mean that for Israelis that criticism is about the Palestinians or about caring about the plight of the Palestinians. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. I think that Israeli public opinion is much more consensual than it is, um, in the midst of a robust debate. I think exactly as you say, most Israelis care about an end to this war only when it comes to the return of the hostages. The Palestinians don't exist. They've never existed as far as the calculus most Israelis use is concerned. Um, and the people who are out in the streets protesting are protesting against the Netanyahu government and its dereliction of duty in failing to return the hostages, not at all, that goes for the great majority, in what I think is carrying out a genocide. But even if you don't think that, in destroying Gaza, in killing tens of thousands of or hundreds of thousands of Palestinians or whatever. And I think that is probably the most important aspect of Israeli public opinion, of which people should be aware. This consensus that is based on the notion that Jewish lives are worth more, and that the whole point of the state of Israel is to protect Jewish lives, and that Palestinian lives, there are differing degrees of how to devalue them, how to dehumanize Palestinians. But the basic assumption is that Palestinians are not our equals. That Palestinian culture is a culture of hate, that it wants to destroy all Jews. I just saw this tweeted today. I see this every day. There are no innocents in Gaza because all Palestinians are Hamas. Palestinian culture is a culture of hate and death. Israel is a robust liberal democracy where people can vote for anyone, including Jews voting for a Palestinian Israeli. So there's absolutely no comparison. We're not even going to start talking about genocides or holocausts or whatever. This notion of Jewish supremacy, I'm not going to call it superiority, it's supremacy. That is the deepest root of Israeli national identity, and it translates effectively into the most hallowed word in the Israeli vocabulary, which is security. Security is apolitical. Everybody thinks that Jewish lives should be defended at all costs, and that runs the gamut from never firing on settlers, even if they attack and kill Palestinians in the West Bank or wherever, to never investigating an Israeli soldier for war crimes in Gaza. That's because Jewish lives are worth more. But the notion of security, which unites all Israelis, regardless of their political persuasion, is that all parties, as partisan as they may be, must devote their maximal efforts, or must place at the top of their agenda the idea that Jewish lives need to be saved at any cost. That is a non-partisan issue here, and that's a consensus when you're quote unquote fighting the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, and you do what you have to do because otherwise Jewish lives would be lost, and then the entire reason for being, what the Germans call Staatsräson, the reason for the state's existence, which in Germany is the defense of Israel. In Israel, the Staatsräson is saving Jewish lives. And if you have to kill or deport or expel or cleanse all the Palestinians to do that, well, that's okay. And that is a consensus that encompasses anywhere between 80 to 90% of Israel's Jewish population.
I know I can already hear the critics saying, but there's Israeli Arabs that get to vote in elections, and we have the Armenian quarter. There's Armenian Christians, but I mean even Armenian Christians can get treated poorly by like Ben Giver types. I mean people will say, well, we still have the vestiges of democracy in Israel, is what I'm getting at. So how do you respond to those people when they try to throw that up?
In many ways, those vestiges, as you rightfully call them, are the best the best form of subterfuge. They're the best obfuscation of the true state of Israeli democracy. And it's not even an underlying assumption. It's so profound. It's such a profoundly held conviction that it is effectively transparent. That in order to be a part of Israeli democracy, you have to accept the fact that this is a Jewish state. And if you accept the fact that this is a Jewish state, then you accept your inferior status. If you are a Palestinian citizen of Israel, then you accept the fact that your town doesn't have a zoning plan. Because if for it to have a zoning plan, the Israeli government must acknowledge and plan for your presence in the future 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now. Israeli governments don't want to do that. So whenever you drive into a Palestinian Israeli town, you know it immediately because of the poor state of every aspect of physical infrastructure. And if you're Armenian, then even the Armenian quarter, which is about 1,000 years old, I think, maybe even older, is open to land grabs made by Jewish settlers, because land grabs made by Jewish settlers always get their days in court, whereas Armenian claims that these are unfair or based on mendacious documents or whatever, they won't necessarily get their day in court. It's exactly the fact that these are vestiges of democracy that allow the Israeli system to ensure an ongoing state of repression in differing degrees towards anyone who isn't Jewish. If this was just clear-cut dictatorship like it is in the West Bank, and it would be, in a way, much easier. Then Israel would say, you know, this is all about security. We're doing what we have to do, but it isn't. It's a democracy masquerading as it's no, that's not the right word. It's a democracy that devotes many of its resources, probably the great majority of its resources, towards maintaining and expanding an anti-democracy. That's the best way to describe Israel. When you live in the Tel Aviv area like me, then yes, you're still a citizen of a democracy, even though the police is becoming politicized and generally, you know, the range of opinions one is allowed to express, not because of the threat of jail time, just because of what counts as normal and normative. That spectrum grows more and more limited every time. But you still live in a democracy. But when you don't live in the Tel Aviv area, when you live in an Arab town, when you live in the Armenian quarter, certainly when you live in the West Bank, you don't live in a democracy. You live under surveillance, you live under strict limitations. It's this mixture that allows repression to thrive, and much more effectively than if this was an open and shut dictatorship.
In terms of that, that's interesting what you said about living in Tel Aviv. You said it's not so much that like you're policed by like government entities, but there's sort of a social sanctioning, right? Like there's an acceptable idea of what's normal. Can you
Yeah,
speak more to that, the element of social sanctioning that goes on?
yeah. Over the past 2 years, it has become a titanic force. The you're simply. I mean, I think I must have mentioned this to you in one of our previous conversations. It's probably worth mentioning again. I don't get many threats, and I'm not described as a treacherous fifth columnist or whatever. And the reason I don't get many threats is because the people who think and talk as I do are so few and far between that we're generally considered insane. You know, not a viable political option, but just off the grid completely. And why waste your time on somebody who's off the grid? There are things that you can't say. You can't compare the plight of the Palestinians to the plight of Israelis, particularly the hostages. You cannot talk about the situation in Gaza at all unless you begin with an impassioned plea to free the hostages and various reminders of how the October 7th Hamas attack was the worst massacre perpetrated on Jews since the Holocaust. But maybe, again, maybe the most important thing is the complete ban on any kind of comparison. You can't compare. What's happening to Israelis, what's happening to Israeli Jews is far worse than anything that might happen to the Palestinians for two reasons. One is the Palestinians brought it upon themselves and we didn't. It just happened to us, maybe because we're too soft and too peace loving. And the second is that our cycle of persecution, our suffering is eternal. With the Palestinians, they're cause and effect. With us, there's no cause and effect. We're on the receiving side of all this hatred because we're Jews and the world hates us. Therefore, everything that happens to us is much, much worse and not at all comparable. And as long as you don't compare, everything pretty much derives from that. You can't talk about the plight of the Palestinians. You can't call for an end to the war and an end to the occupation. I mean, you can, but
Well, you can, but I think the way you've put it elsewhere is that the debate has to be in-house amongst
yes,
other Israelis. Yeah.
yeah. You don't talk about this with strangers. But also, I mean, that was just in the UK. That was what I was referring to after the murders in Manchester. Um, then authorities officially asked the organizers of pro-Palestinian demonstrations not to demonstrate so as to spare Jewish feelings. Now, if you unpack that, what that means is that any kind of pro-Palestinian demonstration is not just an expression of political opinion, but it is a dismissal and a treading upon Jewish emotions, Jewish feelings, Jewish beliefs. It's an anti-Semitic attack, is what it is. Okay, and it is at the very least offensive if it isn't, as Israeli government ministers have claimed, actively encouraging the next murderer. That's the basic assumption that underlies such a request. And yeah, we do that all the time. We do it here too. Going back to your question regarding the consensus in Israel. When demonstrations against the war started, just like when demonstrations against Netanyahu started, the Israeli, now were the radical left, very small minority, wanted to demonstrate against the occupation and say, end the occupation, end the genocide, and everything will begin to get better. They were thrown out of the mass demonstrations. Sometimes they were beaten, but the most common argument was, why do you have to talk about this now? If you talk about this, then you turn away the great majority of Israelis. We don't want this rhetoric here now because it's divisive and it's polarizing. And what we want is unity, and unity is exactly that sort of restrictive quality, dampening quality of control over public discourse that we're talking about.
In terms of where Israel is at with the rest of the world, I think you brought up a very interesting point with the Gulf states. I think a decade ago, you could say that the Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia's biggest concern, was Iran. I don't think that's true anymore. And I've had pretty neutral scholars like James Dorsey say to me that it has changed. Israel is viewed as the threat to stability at this point for the Gulf states. And that doesn't mean they care about the Palestinians, but I mean, this is a major shift. I think the Gulf states just view Israel as kind of a wild card that can jeopardize any stability in the Middle East.
I think the Gulf states value stability above everything else. They're that sort of authoritarian political entities. That's what they want. They don't necessarily want to promulgate any kind of religious interpretation or ideology or whatever. They need stability for the money to keep flowing. And I think it's just a matter of physics. When you look at the Middle East today, the great destabilizer is not Iran, it's Israel. Israel is the country that frightens you the most if you're interested in stability, because Israel has made it a point to demonstrate constantly how it feels it has the freedom to destabilize any given political situation or configuration at will. Israel, that's the whole point of this new Israeli security doctrine. We can do whatever we want, whenever we want. We don't ask anybody. We don't need permission. And that, as far as the Gulf states are concerned, is an existential threat. And I mean, again, this is not a theoretical issue. Israel struck Doha. Okay? It attacked a Gulf monarchy with very little warning. I actually believe that Israel did notify the United States very, very briefly before the attack itself, and that the Qataris were notified when the explosives were already going off. That sounds very logical to me.
Does the Israeli body politic realize this, that this is how the Gulf states are starting to perceive Israel?
Well, yes and no. First, the Israeli body politic doesn't really care what the Gulf states think. It doesn't care about Arab perception. The Gulf states want deals. Okay? That's what they want. That's all they want, as far as we're concerned. They don't like us, but they will tolerate our existence if we can provide for them in a way that they see as appropriate. That's one thing, and the other is, okay, so they see us as problematic right now, but how are we comparable in any way to Iran? Of course, they hate Iran. It's a religious war. It's a 1,300-year conflict. As bad as we are, we will never be as bad as Iran. And even if they do, we'll figure it out. We'll find a way to straighten it out. We'll get the U.S. to straighten it out. We will provide them with good business conditions. We will make it worth their while. So ultimately, no, the Israeli public doesn't see, but that's because, and I refer to this in passing, but it's also, I think, an important point. The Israeli public doesn't care. That is a major, major aspect of being an Israeli right now. It's not just carrying the banner of suffering and victimization. It's also about not caring. Okay, so what? Screw it. We've given up on the future anyway. Who cares about consequences? Who cares about implications? We don't. And we're doing what we have to do. And if you don't get that, then you're either crazy or you've been corrupted by the rising alliance of global Islam and wokeism. And why should we care about what you're saying? You're weak. We just had, again, I'm going back to this episode in the UK where the Israeli government invited Tommy Robinson to visit Israel. And the British Board of Deputies, which is the biggest Jewish organization in the UK, wrote a very angry letter saying this guy is a racist and you're endangering our communities. And they received a response from Israel's Minister of Diaspora Communities, who said the Board of Deputies used to be a responsible organization, but now they've been taken over by woke Islamism. So it's not a surprise that they are siding with the government rather than acknowledging that Tommy Robinson and his responsible opinions are the future. You and I have talked about this, and you've asked me very sensibly about how strange it feels sometimes that when you ask critical questions, you have to wonder whether you might be the crazy one, because all the Israelis keep reiterating that you are crazy and that the situation is as Israel describes it. I think this episode that I just related demonstrates that we really are, living in a.
Real
Yeah,
quick,
go
with
ahead.
regards to Tommy Robinson, what gets me is beyond, his ideology and racism and whatnot. I mean, Tommy Robinson is just a thug.
Yeah.
He's a thuggish personality, and I mean, if you're friendly with someone that thuggish, you have to start wondering, am I on the right side of things? Like you're
Our
teaming up with a thug. Take the
our
ideology
minister,
out of it. He's a thug. Yeah.
our minister of diaspora communities is a thug. And before he became a government minister, he was an educator, which gives you a sense of what sort of education he was giving his students. He's a thug. That's exactly what he is. And Israel, like the thug that it is right now, has no option but to constantly ratchet up, constantly escalate, constantly turn up the volume, constantly make accusations more heated and more extreme. We have lost completely and willingly the option of nuance. There is absolutely no nuance in the way Israelis understand reality. Of course, Israelis will be happy to tell you that it's the other way around. We're the only ones who understand the complexity. We understand the Hamas campaign, that Hamas campaigns are a masterwork of manipulation. We understand the deep forces at play here. This whole, it's
When you say the deep forces, this gets into, I think the general idea for a lot of pro-Israel people is there is a massive, almost, I don't want to compare it to this, but it's almost like a protocols of Zion type conspiracy, but instead of Jews, it's the woke left and global Islamism. And they're going to, we are the one country that can save the West. We're the ones that are gonna, we're the wall keeping the barbarians from getting through.
precisely, yeah, it's we're fighting against Islamo wokeism. And in that
Yeah,
sense,
I hope you, I don't know what you, do you think it is very conspiratorial, the mindset that drives that?
I think it's what's his name, Alex Jones level and Stephen Miller level. That's where we are right now. And we won't shy away from the QAnon people if they present themselves. Yeah, that's exactly where we are right now. But again, as you say, if you look at Israel, if you look at Israeli rhetoric over the past 2 years, you will find that it has escalated tremendously from October 7th, 2023. And if you understand that this is all Israel has done over the past 2 years, escalate and exacerbate and stoke the flames, and then you need to ask yourself whether this is a viable strategy or it's just a reaction. And that's another important point. I don't know that Israelis were dyed in the wool conspiracy buffs, but they turned into dyed in the wool conspiracy buffs because they had no other choice. Because the Israeli case became more and more difficult to defend. Because the notion that what Israel is doing was right became more and more far fetched. And as it grew more and more far fetched, you had to resort to things like Islamo wokeism. That's what we're doing. That's what we're fighting. And I don't remember if I've said this to you, but I have no doubt that if today Hitler was alive and active and was targeting Muslims rather than Jews, he would have found a great ally in Jerusalem. Okay, because we're totally on board. It's exactly the elders of Zion. And we do that. Not only do we do that constantly, but we always take it up a notch. And the end, again, it's physics. It's very clear. If you continue to turn up the volume, you will either fry your eardrums or fry the speaker. You can't do this uh, to no end. Okay, there's no infinity here. And we are getting very close, if we haven't already gotten to the stage where we can't do it anymore. But it's addictive because it's loud and you can't hear any other kind of opinion, any other kind of voice, no nuance whatsoever, only yourself, and you're as loud as you can be and louder. So, where is resistance going to come from?
I hope this isn't too much of a distraction, but I wanted to ask you about, I know that the infamous spy Jonathan Pollard, I guess, is trying to make a bid for the Knesset. I'm curious what you think of Pollard because I get the impression he's kind of a weirdo sort of celebrity character in Israel and not necessarily taken uber seriously.
Yeah.
Um, what's your take on figures like Pollard? Do you think in some ways the focus on the far right takes away from looking at the bigger picture?
It does but that's exactly the same as it is in the United States because the human characters on the far right are ever so much more picturesque and compelling. It's much easier to talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene than it is to talk about Josh Hawley. Okay, even though they might espouse similar opinions, or somebody like Mike Lee, or even Speaker Johnson,
Well,
House Speaker
I
Johnson.
would go farther than you. I would even say, we just had that episode of Bill Maher that came out that the former Obama official Van Jones was talking about.
Yeah,
It's all a Qatari conspiracy.
yeah,
They've brainwashed our children, and all we hear about is dead Gazan babies, dead Gazan babies, like it's some kind of joke. And it's like
yeah.
this is not Van Jones is not considered like a far right-wing guy, but he's, I
Dude,
mean,
you had Thomas Friedman in the studio chuckling when Van Johnson described it as a punchline, if I recall.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Uh,
I
a
guess what
cons
I'm saying is it's not just like these Republicans. It's
no,
not only is it not just Marjorie Taylor Greene, it's not just a Josh Hawley.
no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think we started out by saying that Biden administration and Biden personally, they were all much more beholden to Israel ideologically than the Trump administration is. And think about how that ties in with the consensus I was describing earlier in Israeli public opinion. The consensus is much greater than it seems. In America as well, um, the enforcement of the mores of this capitalist social order, they are shared by the Democratic Party establishment as much as they are by the Republican Party establishment. And it's not a mistake that it was somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene who was one of the first Republican politicians to come out against this, because she, with her political wiles, identified that this was an actual speaking point. Americans, that's not what Americans voted for. It's not what Americans wanted. I've developed this, again, to show you how weird times are getting. I've got this weird little relationship with the Cato Institute people who keep publishing articles saying that Israel is a liability to the United States. I find myself
Do you happen to
agreeing
know
with,
who wrote those articles, or
yeah, a scholar at Cato named John Hoffman. He and I are
John's a
friends.
friend of the show.
Yeah. So John and I are friendly on Twitter. I would never in a million years have assumed that I would agree with anybody who is remotely affiliated with the Cato Institute, but I do. And I retweet John, and I will be meeting John later this month because he's coming to Israel with some Cato bigwigs, and they want to talk to me. I would never have assumed that this would have been the first major American think tank who would have wanted to talk to me. But yeah, I mean, the extremes are now united against the middle, and the middle is vast. And you're absolutely right. It's the Democratic establishment. It's um, Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries as much as it is
Well,
Josh Hawley.
I guess you're talking about the American end of that. How does that play out in Israel? Because I wanted to get back to that. I said, I mentioned Pollard. I mentioned people will say Netanyahu's war, and it doesn't go beyond that. And I want to say that I understand why people do that, but I think there is something getting missed when we do that, when we focus just on the far right in Israel, and that's the be all end all problem.
I will be as blunt as I can be. This is not Netanyahu's war. This is Israel's war. And Netanyahu's would-be opposition thinks exactly the way he does, even if they um, camouflage it with all kinds of words, like the head of what used to be Israeli labor, they now call themselves the Democrats, is saying obviously there can't be a Palestinian state because that would be a prize for terrorism, but we need a civil breakup that is allow the Palestinians autonomy to manage their economic affairs with complete security, freedom, and access for Israel, which means what? Exactly that Israel can reinvade Gaza or invade the West Bank whenever it so chooses. That's the opposition. That's the left end of the viable opposition to Netanyahu. I'm not even talking about Israeli Palestinian parties. So you don't need people like Pollard. People like Pollard are comic relief. He is a weirdo. He's very American. He is much beloved by the hazy right. We still have a hazy right here in Israel. But that pales before the power of the middle ground. And the middle ground now in Israel is, uh, in many ways, Tommy Robinson. That's the middle ground. It's conspiratorial. It is self-victimizing. It is absolutely refusing to discuss any kind of viable strategic future. It's all about doing what you have to do, and the common denominator is so common here. And it shows itself in various aspects. One prominent one being where we started this conversation just now, the fact that the people who are out in the streets demonstrating are absolutely demonstrating about the Israeli hostages and not at all about the Palestinians.
I wanted to talk too about what is the situation with the West Bank and people. I ask you this because a lot of people talk about the settlers and they talk only about it in terms of like the Daniela Weiss characters, but I think there's a lot of settlers that are just like um, poorer like college kids and they're just getting cheap land. But that's also a problem because they're living past the I think it's the green line. And I don't there's a bigger problem than just the Daniela Weiss characters.
There is
Okay. I don't know
the
if you can
Israeli.
explain that, and I hope I wasn't
I
misexplaining
can
it or
No, no. I think you're absolutely right. The Israeli state, um, Israel's greatest act of state, in as far as continuity and resources and commitment goes, has been the creation of the Israeli presence in the West Bank, the creation of a parallel state in the West Bank. And I say parallel because officially Israeli law generally does not apply in the West Bank. The sovereign in the West Bank is the general who commands Israel, the Israeli military central command. And Israel has done everything it can to encourage, as you say, run of the mill Israelis, not ideologues, to move to the West Bank, including subsidizing land, subsidizing education, providing much better and more comprehensive welfare from education to health than the great majority of Israelis get within the 1967 Israel. And this really has been continuously something that all Israeli governments found themselves committed to doing. Okay, there's no real difference between right-wing governments, national unity governments, and labor-led governments as far as settling the West Bank goes. Why? For different reasons. Right-wing governments were all about, or not all about, but were a lot of it was about national honor and not giving our ancestral land to the enemy. As far as the labor governments went, it was about achieving strategic depth. Should we be invaded again by Arab countries or whatever? But it all converged into a single continuous endeavor. Um, and now it's really the rotten fruits of the rotten tree. Okay, now there are hundreds of thousands of Israeli Jews in the West Bank. The great majority of them live in fortified settlements, usually on top of the hills. Palestinians occupy the valleys, but they don't work in those settlements. The settlements are not. Um, they just sleep there, basically. They work in Jerusalem. They work in Tel Aviv. They work wherever. Um, and alongside these people, there's a very loud, vocal, ideological element, religious. And that religious element wants the West Bank to become Israel fully, wants to annex the West Bank, and more than anything, just wants to
Judea
take
and
over.
Samaria, right?
That's the official Israeli name. Wants to take these religious settlers, what they want to do is take Palestinians' land and drive Palestinians off the land. And they do it with the full support and endorsement of the Israeli state. Because again, and I remember us talking about this, if you have a conflagration where a group of young religious settlers gets into it with a group of Palestinians, if these young settlers walk into a Palestinian village and start throwing rocks or destroying property or whatever, and the Palestinians want to defend themselves and they start throwing rocks as well. If you call in the Israeli military will shoot Palestinians, will arrest the Palestinians. They will not arrest the Jews. And this is just an ongoing state, an ongoing progression. It started out with settlements that were very much ideological in the late 1970s, and then it just became the norm. And now, um, I mean, if once Jews could not freely carry out acts of very hostile violence, certainly over the past 2 years, this has escalated greatly because if you've got the official Israeli military destroying Gaza house by house, what's another little Palestinian hamlet being torn up by settler youth? You know, again, for as far as most Israelis are concerned, it's not so much carrying out our biblical mission as much as it is not caring.
I mentioned this because, there's always been people that have clung to the two-state solution that will say to me, well, those non-ideological settlers, the young college kids that just want, cheap housing, the Israeli government could pay them off to leave. And then we could do a land swap scenario. That's the theory. Even those people that I've talked to that believe that are saying now, I think it's been foreclosed upon. You can't do it anymore. Um, because there's too many of these ideological settlers and there's too many settlers there now. So you can't, they're not going to leave. And I don't know what that entails for the future. And I'm not sure anyone has really, it's almost like no one wants to talk about these issues.
No one wants to talk about these issues. No one wants to talk about the future. The future is, not just
The future itself has been foreclosed upon.
yeah, exactly. It's not that it's uncharted and undiscovered. It's threatening. The very notion of a future is threatening to the collective Israeli psyche at the moment. Are there too many religious settlers? I don't know if there are too many religious settlers. I don't know that their number is that great, but they have a plan. And in that sense, they're very rare among Israeli factions. They
Maybe
have
it
a
would have been
plan.
better to say they're very well organized. It's not that they need
Yes,
many of them, but they're well organized. Yeah.
exactly. They have a plan and they know exactly what they're doing. So to get them out of the places they have forcibly taken over will require massive lethal engagement with the military. And the way things are currently in Israel at the moment, the military won't necessarily do that, and it will not be ordered to do so by its political overlords. I don't think that the two-state solution is viable. Then again, nobody in Israel, I mean, no ordinary run-of-the-mill Israeli believes that one-state solution is viable because if there's a one state, they will obviously kill us. And generally thinking, I don't know that this is time to be talking about solutions. There are so many measures that can be taken, that need to be taken before you talk about some kind of broader political strategy. Palestinians need to be heard. The genocide needs to be acknowledged. Gaza needs to be reconstructed. The right of Palestinians to life, okay, I'm not even talking about equality or justice, needs to be guaranteed. This will take years, okay? Israel will be forced to do it. So there's a lot of time before we can even start talking about any kind of political process. To do so now is useful for Israeli interests because Israelis can, when they do that, they can just cast what has happened over the past 2 years as yet another installment in the 100-year-long conflict. Okay, so, we had a war and now we have to get out of that war and we have to rebuild and we have to meet. There's the entire peace industry, as it's cynically called here. But what's happened over the past 2 years is not simply another installment in the conflict. It is, uh, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as a lot of other people are concerned, it's genocide. And you don't gloss over genocide. And you certainly don't resolve genocide with negotiations for peace. What does peace mean in the context of genocide? It doesn't, and it shouldn't mean much of anything. And so that's why I think that, I'll say it clearly. I'm a one-stater. I don't think the two-state solution is feasible. I understand the two-staters. I don't think it's completely unfeasible. I think it can be done if there's enough will, and it might be the politically expedient thing to do. But either way, this is not a time for grand solutions. This is a time for quiet. This is a time for reckoning. It's a time for, balancing the scales, all of those things that have not been done. And it's a time for listening, certainly for Israelis. It's a time for Israelis to shut the hell up about their feelings and about their suffering and about the complications that they've gone through and all that. It's a time for Palestinian voice to finally be heard about this genocide, and that really precedes any kind of grand bargain by a great deal.
There were just like one or two more things I wanted to mention here. I mean, in a lot of ways, there's an interesting thinker out there, Ian Lustig, who wrote a book called The One State Reality. And
Sure.
I mean, I think there is sort of a one state reality already. It's Israel is sort of in control from the river to the sea. And I think that's interesting because I don't think Israel has really wanted to completely define its borders. And that's eventually going to become a problem because I think Americans are starting to look at it as, well, if you don't want to define, you know, what is and isn't part of Israel, what's the Palestinian land and what's the Israeli land, if you're not going to do that, then it already is a de facto one state. And you're not that means the Palestinians are your problem. Like, it's not like they're an external threat. It's your policing problem. So why should we in America be paying our tax dollars to do that? Um, to aid your cause. And I see that becoming more common, especially on the right wing. What do you make of the American discourse on these things right now? I guess is what I'm getting at.
I think it's absolutely correct. And I think that argument, by the way, is also one of the initial arguments that needs to be made against Israel's actions in Gaza, because this isn't a war. This is Israel fighting a territory that it occupies and has legally or illegally occupied for decades and decades. That's a major point. But yes, Israel doesn't want to clarify what its borders are. And you can see that right now in Syria and Lebanon and Yemen as well. Israel wants the right to spread. And it does not feel like it should be interrupted in any way. And it feels like it should have complete freedom to choose when to do it and how to do it. And, even the United States, with its sense of manifest destiny, has its borders, right? From sea to shining sea. Uh, Israel is the only country that prides itself on not having borders. So I think the sentiment on the American right is absolutely correct. Uh,
And
and I
I wouldn't
think,
say it's just the American. I'm starting to hear this from like even like apolitical quote unquote normies, that aren't.
ab-
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. I think the American sentiment is absolutely correct. And I think it's not coincidental that this is the kind of opposition that you're beginning to hear now, because I think it's difficult for Americans to, divorce Israel on moral grounds. Yet, I mean, still at this point, it's not. It's difficult, right? We have a special relationship, and a lot of Americans are devoted to the notion of this capitalistic global order and so on. But Israel really has gone through a lot of trouble, has made a real effort to burn its bridges, to be to not just do what it wants, but to do it in a despicable way, to be contemptuous of everybody who's supported it, to say, "Oh, really? That's the best you can do? Well, you should do better."
Well, that's actually one of the reasons I mentioned Jonathan Pollard because I think he's a kooky character, but in a
Yeah,
weird way, I think he actually has seen the future in a certain way because he constantly says we can't rely on the U.S. The U.S. is going to stab us in the back eventually. And I don't think it's going to be a stab in the back. I think it's just going to be you've become a liability uh,
yeah,
to
I
U.S.
agree.
interests. But, you know, Pollard's probably right. At some point, the U.S. isn't going to tolerate this anymore, and Israel will be on its own.
I agree completely. And I think, if if AOC is considering a run for the presidency in 28, I think it should behoove her to consider this point. It's not we don't want to be friends with Israel because Israel is immoral. We don't want to be friends with Israel because Israel actively, physically takes from the mouths of American working people to care to to do this crap. That's a very, very nonpartisan point. It's not even a bipartisan point. It's a nonpartisan point. And yeah, that rhetoric is out there, I totally see it manifesting itself in discourse in the United States, but also between the United States and Israel in the near future. Because really, there is no exaggerating what an effort Israel has made to be universally abhorred. And this isn't, again, some abstract moral stuff. This is just behavior. I mean, everything from that letter to the British Board of Deputies to the personal insults leveled at global leaders. Israel really wants to be despised. And you know what? You want it long enough, you'll get it.
Why do they want to be despised?
Because that's proof of life. That's proof that everything we've done so far is correct.
It's proof that we
Uh,
still have heartbeat in a weird way.
yeah, and I'll see you, I'll see that and raise it. The only way we can truly prove that we are absolutely correct in everything we've done is through our demise. Maybe not just completely collapsing and ceasing to exist, but ceasing to exist in a meaningful way. Because we've gone so far, we've done such horrible things that the only way we can truly demonstrate our perennial victim status is by dying, because that's what the ultimate victims do, by martyring ourselves, if you will. And I think that's part of the Israeli collective psyche. A lot of people, I don't know if they'd be willing to articulate that, but I think a lot of people think so. A lot of people are riveted to what's happening because, it's like not being able to take your eyes off a train wreck.
A few months back, there was an American commentator, a right-wing guy that's associated with Ben Shapiro, Michael Knowles, who was complaining. You saw the stuff that happened with the Palestinian church, the
Yeah.
Catholic Church in Gaza, and he got very upset and said, "Well, I don't attack Israel or anything, but how do you like bomb a church?" And then he said, "And also, why are they doing side quests? Like, why are we bombing Iran? Why is Israel bombing? Like, if you want the hostages back, get the." And he was just saying he's like getting exasperated. So he feels like Israel is doing all these different little side quests. Oh, we have to do this with Yemen. We have to do this with the Golan Heights. We have to, and he was just exasperated by it. And it was interesting because I think what his main point was what has been accomplished by all of this. Hamas is still in power. Um, the hostages are mostly dead, and they haven't been returned to Israel. And I wonder, is there a sense in Israel of that this has all been for naught? Like, what has really been accomplished?
I think we started out our conversation referring to this. I think there's a sense, but I think you'd be hard pressed to again hear this verbalized by many or Israelis or any Israelis at all, because it's very painful. It's very painful. You might hear people say, "Well, this is Netanyahu. Netanyahu does all these things because he wants to sabotage the efforts, because he's an ideologue, because he's mad, because it's his war." But when Netanyahu attacked Iran for naught, by the way, even with regard to the nuclear program and to Trump's assistance, the entire country was united, was up at arms. We'll take as many missiles as we need, Mr. Prime Minister, as long as you carry out this momentous quest. So it's very painful to come to terms with the fact that this is all for nothing. But the flip side is that the more you do this, the more this tells you that the more this is the only thing that tells you that you're in the right, that what you're doing is legitimate, that what you're doing is okay. You have to constantly snipe at your enemies, and you have to constantly have more enemies. That's what I was talking about when I said the only proof of our ultimate virtue is our demise, because um, you can't have any friends. If you have any friends, as you're doing these things, as you're carrying out a genocide, but as you're carrying out all these side quests, as you call them, then if you have friends and these are not side quests, if you have friends, if you have people who are with you on this, then you are, uh, you know, you're getting validation, you're getting verification from external sources. But the only way you can prove you're right is by showing the world that the only verification you need comes from yourself. You and I have talked about my fascination with the notion of solipsism, this idea that you're the only real person in the world and there's nobody else who's real. I think we're only getting more solipsistic as time goes by. And while we want love and we want to belong, probably existentially, we want to be reviled even more. Because if we are reviled, then we are truly alone and we are truly the only people who are real. And our set of considerations is the only one that is actually true. And that is a remarkably sad point. And again, it's a very painful thing to feel that, in the midst of life, we are in death, and vice versa. It started out by us living when they die. But now, in order for us to live, at least in eternity, we have to die right now. We have to be thrown out of everywhere. We have to be boycotted. We have to be blacklisted. We have to be ostracized. That is the only way we can fully ascertain that we are correct.
It's almost like you're saying that Israel needs like these Greta Thunberg figures to validate themselves.
Oh, yeah. But by the way, that's exactly why Greta brings out such vile, obnoxiousness from Israelis. Why Israelis feel like they can drag her by her hair or force her to drape herself with an Israeli flag. Exactly, because on the one hand, we will talk of her as a cartoon figure, right? Some Hasbara stooge tweeted after seeing a tweet that said Greta was abused by being placed in a holding cell with bed bugs. Some Hasbara stooge tweeted back that bed bugs were abused by being placed in a holding cell with Greta. Okay, so we make fun of her, but we also, we understand where she's coming from. We understand why she chastises us.
It's
And
interesting because a while back there's this. I mean, he's not really a political commentator, but he gets involved in his anti-woke politics. This guy, Dave Portnoy from Barstool Sports, and he's going on rants about, right wingers shouldn't make fun of Israel because, that leads to it'll lead to the next Shoah. But then in the same breath, he'll like dehumanize and make jokes about how Greta should be eaten by cannibals or whatever, which I'm like, but you're doing the same thing that anti-Semites do. Like he's dehumanizing her in the same way that anti-Semites, like actual anti-Semites, dehumanize Jews. I don't,
it's
yeah.
no, I couldn't agree more. And it's extremely blunt. It's no longer about some sort of gray area where there's room for interpretation. You get somebody who's like a mainstream commentator saying Palestinians all belong to a culture of death. All they want to do is kill Jews. That's the only reason for being, as far as they're concerned. Whereas Jews are initially and ultimately peace loving, and all we want to do is we just want to be left alone. And if we're left alone, then we can then we'll be okay with everybody. Yeah.
I was listening to this guy, this British commentator, who's really pro-Zionist, right-wing figure, Andrew Gould, who was saying, "You guys don't understand. It pains us what we have to do to
Oh, yeah.
Gaza. It's painful, but this is all Hamas's fault."
Yeah.
And like, I mean, I don't. There's like dead children. I just don't
Uh,
understand.
I'll add something to the dead children that you mentioned, and that is that there has not, over the past 2 years, been a single Israeli soldier who has been independently investigated, not to say indicted, for any kind of wrongdoing. I'm not even going to call them war crimes in Gaza. One, not one. Okay.
do you think there's an unspoken idea that, well, I've heard it spoken actually, but I think sometimes it's unspoken, which is, well, these dead children, if they're not dead, they'll become terrorists. That they're going to be Islamists. They want to kill
Where,
Jews.
where,
They're just going to be part of the cult of death.
where did you get that this was an unspoken idea? In Israel, in Israel,
Well,
it's very much in Israel, it's very much a spoken idea.
there is no
Yeah,
innocence. Yeah, there are no
yeah.
innocents.
There are no innocents, and the children will only grow up to be terrorists. It's not their fault, by the way. They're victims of the hate culture in which they were raised, you know, but you can't ignore reality. So you really do have people who will talk about them as being animals completely beyond the pale of any kind of negotiation or engagement, and about us being just good, solid, pragmatic people. And they will not see the dehumanization. They will not see how it's a double-edged sword. They will just uh, yeah. It's just the reason I don't like using words like insane is because that um, has the connotations of an anomaly. I get a lot of reactions saying, well, Jews are like that or Zionists are like that. This isn't about, I mean, of course it's about Zionism as much as it is about anything, but this is about a human phenomenon. Israelis are not insane. Uh, this is Israelis, as far as they're concerned, are very sane. And if you talk about this out of context, if this is like, okay, so we just have to eradicate the Zionist state, you haven't done much of anything. This is humanity at its worst, but it needs to be addressed as humanity, not just as this kind of alien that has installed itself in humanity's gut. Israelis are not aliens. Israelis are sadly only too human in that respect. And I think all human beings should take an active interest in what's happening to Israelis, not because it will necessarily happen to them, but because it can probably happen to them given the proper circumstances.
I know that your focus is on Palestinians need to have their voices heard. I did want to ask you this, and I hope it's not too odd of a question, but I've thought about this talking to people like yourself and Yoav Shamir, the Israeli filmmaker who did the movie Defamation. Um, you've talked, and Yoav has talked about this with me too, how there's this sense that we can be nothing other than victims of history. And it's true that there has been real persecution against Jews in history, and that's part of, I would say, Jewish history and even a part of Jewish identity. But in a weird way, I think flattening all of Jewish identity down to its own, like we are only defined by persecution. I almost think it does like a violence upon Jewish identity and Jews themselves. I hope that makes sense. I just don't think that victimhood alone is what defines Jewish people.
Of course it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. But if you want historical contextualization, a lot of it has to do with the establishment of Israel. Establishment of Israel is always presented by Israelis and a lot of Jews all over the world as a kind of a fulfillment of the Jewish dream. And maybe it was, but it was also a tremendous rupture. It broke Jewish spirit apart because being Jewish meant being different for millennia. And a lot of Jews made their own sense of what being different means and how you can be different and how you should be different. There was a lot of diversity within the Jewish sense of self when Jews were a minority community. But when Israel was established, Judaism almost overnight became the new normal, became an epitome for conformism. And that it didn't just establish Jews as victims, nor did the Second World War, but it stifled a lot of the conversations that were so characteristic of the Jewish spirit and the Jewish intellectual tradition. You no longer had need for so many conversations. You could just concentrate your efforts on keeping the state alive. And I think that for a long, long time, that rift, that rupture, was less apparent. And I think if these 2 years have had a very significant effect on making that rift much more visible, much more accessible, much more pertinent to Jews on both sides. And Israeli Judaism is much, much more different than it was from American Judaism 2 years ago. Now, so you're absolutely right. We were never just victims. We were always a lot of things, including intellectuals and people who study and people who venerate the intellect. Um, and we have to. I know that Peter Beinart wrote a very interesting book on how to be Jewish after Gaza. We have to rediscover what it means to be Jewish. As far as most Israelis are concerned, we don't. It's very obvious. We have to take our lives into our own hands, be masters of our own destiny, and kill anybody who wants to kill us. But other people, they think differently.
I know I've kept you long here, but just two brief things. Since you mentioned Biner, I hear a lot of conversation here in the US, even from people that consider themselves anti or non-Zionists, and they'll say, "Oh, that Peter Biner is just he's just a liberal," and I'm like, I mean, he's a proponent of a one state, you know, democratic state for all. I don't understand the sort of attacks I see on him, and I was wondering what your perception of Beinart is. 'Cause I think he's quite level-headed, to be honest.
Yeah, so do I. I think it has to do with the strangeness of the times. Uh, and I find myself, not to compare myself to Beinart, but I find myself in a similar predicament. As time goes by, I find myself growing more acute and abridged in the way I express myself. My posts on social media grow shorter. There's less to say about more and more.
Well, what's
And
left to say after the past 2 years in a lot of ways? I mean,
True,
it's
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And I think people who are the most radical now are the most level-headed. And yeah, I think Peter Beinart is, by the way, very much an American pragmatist. I don't think he's a liberal. I think he really wants to look. I hear echoes of William James and Richard Rorty and what he writes, not some kind of bleeding heart hippie whatever. He's not at all. He's very American in that sense, which makes him very difficult for Israeli readers, but maybe also for American readers because that kind of tradition is uh, now maligned and sidetracked in American letters and in American discourse. But he's very American, yeah, in a
Closing
good
out,
way.
I guess I wanted to close out on getting back around to I think the most controversial thing that comes up when I talk to you is always this issue of the criticism that you have of not just Netanyahu, but of liberal or centrist Zionists. Because I do have people that listen to the show, even though they often disagree with me and my guests, uh, that are like liberal Zionists. And it's funny because a lot of them take anything that is said very personally, and it's not like personal. I have friends that would consider themselves liberal Zionists. I don't like think to myself, "Oh, we need to put you in a gulag or something." It's not personal at all. It's not driven by any hate. I just think that they're not seeing problems or contradictions within their own thinking. I was wondering if you could comment on the issue of, or the contradictions of liberal Zionism, because I think it's something that doesn't get talked about. And when you broach it, people can get very heated in a way that I actually find very confusing.
I see your point, and moving forward with the spirit of brevity. Uh, Again, Zionism, can an ideology be liberal if it maintains a contradiction in terms at its heart? Can you have a national revival that by definition denies that revival denies a life of liberalism and equality and uh, everything that the liberals hold dear from another people, and makes it even a zero-sum game. You know, the more we deny them, the more we have it for ourselves. Can this be called liberalism? And very simply put, very starkly put, this is what Israel does. This is what Israel has been doing since 1948, perhaps more so since 1967. Israel is a democracy with uh, a bizarro democracy at its heart, with an anti-democracy at its heart. And if you are a Zionist today and you support that state of affairs, I'm not even talking about the genocide. But the genocide seems to me to be a logical derivative of that state of affairs. If you feel like you can defend what I consider to be a paradox, if you feel like you can be both liberal and vehemently anti-liberal in the same sense, it doesn't matter if it's because you have to. As you say, it's not personal at all. It's about practical circumstances of life. If you feel like you can do that, then I feel like that will ultimately crack. And I think that the past 2 years have shown what it looks like when it cracks. When it cracks, it tends towards the most extreme. It's an existential storm. It can't be left standing. It will tend towards the most engrossing, all-encompassing, I'm sorry to use this word, it's a loaded word now, but solution that there can be, because there's no other way. And if liberalism is, negotiation and pragmatism and context and an understanding of values in real situations, what's been happening in Israel over the past 2 years has been a stark denial of the real.
Not just in Israel. I was going to say that, but
Yeah,
and I promise I'll let you go after this. But I was going to say,
right.
since you mentioned pragmatism, I saw with Kamala Harris's new book, she was going off about why did they protest me, the uncommitted people, and I'm fine with people if they want to criticize the uncommitted campaign that happened in the U.S. Fine, but she was like, why were they protesting me and not Trump? And there was one very simple reason they didn't protest Trump. Trump's part of the Republican Party. They don't think they can influence him in any way whatsoever. It was Democrats trying to influence Kamala Harris to take a greater stand on Gaza and Palestinian lives.
Yeah,
Likewise, I saw recently Bill Maher on TV going on about, well, why is it you never see these protesters talking about the genocide in the Sudan? And, they're not protesting Boko Haram. And I'm like, well, some kids in Brooklyn could protest Boko Haram and it wouldn't have any effect. Because like the
yeah.
US isn't giving them money. You know? I mean,
No,
the reason people are
absolutely.
protesting Israel is because the US is aiding Israel. I mean, what I'm saying is that the arguments are so weak at this point, and they're
I
bizarrely
agree.
weak. I
I,
don't know what you
I,
think of that.
I agree completely. I think they are exactly that. They're bizarrely weak, and again, there's deep denial involved here. There's a denial of reality. I get a lot of. I'll make this personal about myself. Okay, and I'll say two things. One is that the reason I am as active as I am is exactly because I feel like I belong. This is my place. I need to fight for it. Nobody else can fight for it. And another thing is, I get a lot of reactions from people who are on the silly global left who say something like, well, you should give back your stolen house and go back to Europe where you're from, or fill your car up with gas, with water and bread, and just drive through the barricades on the Gaza border until you're stopped. No, no, because that won't get anything done, because I don't think that's effective, because I am a part of this reality. And as a part of this reality, I'm committed to this reality. And if now what I need to do is, as you so graciously said, bear witness. And that's part of being a part of this reality. It's not from some sort of moral high ground. I don't feel myself occupying the moral high ground. I feel myself trying to make the best I can of this reality. And people like Bill Maher and those arguments on Sudan and Syria and Boko Haram, they're exactly that. They're bizarrely weak because they're not of this reality. In this reality, of course, you care about Israel. Of course, Israel is, the case. I mean, Israelis have made tremendous efforts to keep Israel at the top of every kind of agenda over the past 80 years. Okay, we want this. And now we are mystified at how it is that everybody cares about Israel. Everybody cares about Israel because we pushed Israel down their throat. And again, this is real. Think of AIPAC. AIPAC is the most powerful lobbying organization in the United States. It's not coincidental that everybody cares about Israel. Everybody cares about Israel because this caring has been financed by hundreds of billions of dollars that have gone through, various election cycles. And to claim that that isn't so, that it's about either some kind of abstract morals or about some kind of relative matrix is bizarre. It's not. That's not the way the world works. It's not. We're people. And I agree with you. It gets bizarrely weak. And the reason it gets bizarrely weak is because it's impossible to defend. And the more time goes by, the more Israel does this, the more this behavior is augmented. The more difficult it becomes to defend, even now. I don't know where the end is. Hopefully we're starting to see it, but it's horrible. Just horrible. I don't have a better, more sophisticated word for it. It's horrible.
Well, we'll leave it at that. As always, this conversation was probably therapeutic for me in a lot of ways because I feel like a lot of our conversations are, I'm asking you, am I crazy for thinking this, Ori? Because it feels like we're in a gaslighting nation at this point.
It's therapeutic for me as well. I'm always grateful because, even I get to second guessing at some points because the sheer force of the gang press here is so intense that I'm very happy to have a chance to talk to you and through you to your listeners and to get this conversation going, to remind myself not just that there's a world out there, but that there's a community of level-headed people. I like that. Being level-headed strikes me as probably the most difficult thing to be at this moment in time.
Thank you again, Ori Goldberg, for coming on Parallax Views.
My pleasure as always.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program.
Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.